I know many of you. I'm Professor Mazza. I met a number of you in October, and you'll may recall that at that time you talked to me about your interest in Latin America, and one of them was what was going on in Brazil. So I said, okay, we're going to use the moment when Dean Campante is coming for the big ceremony that we had yesterday, and we'll organize our first seminar on Brazil. So this is a case of you asked for it, you got it, so here we are. We're going to have short presentations by Dean Campante, Alessandro Merli, and then myself. But then we'll really open up for your questions, and the idea is to be pretty informal about this. And then afterwards, we'll invite you all for even more informality downstairs at Julio's bar. So to start off, Dean Campante is the Vice Dean for Faculty Affairs and Research. Most importantly for us, he is a Brazilian economist, grew up and lived in Rio de Janeiro. But he's a special kind of economist because he both teaches and writes on economics, but he really understands the politics, the political economy. And he'll probably tell you that to be an economist in Brazil, you kind of need to know politics. And so you're going to see a lot of politics in his presentation. And he's will focus first on the Lula administration, where the economy is, and then we'll pass to Alessandro Merli. So Filipe, with no further ado, you I'm learning how to do this.
It's click on PowerPoint.
Yeah, I guess the first PowerPoint.
Yeah. There you go.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Welcome, bem-vindos, those of you who are studying Portuguese, maybe. We're glad that we're hopefully bringing Portuguese back in DC. So those of you who go to DC next year should be able to continue your Portuguese studies. Thanks, Jackie, for the kind introduction and for putting this together. I think is a great opportunity. Both being here in Bologna, which is always great, and I figure like whenever we had a chance to come here, like we just grab it with all our strength. And also, this panel has given me the opportunity to kind of collect some of my thoughts about Brazil, because one thing that has been the case in the last year, and we're talking about that earlier today, is that Brazil has gotten quite a bit more boring than it had been for the last 10 years, and that's a great thing, right? So, and I feel like the last few years I had been like following Brazilian events, like with this intensity, and this year you kind of like got a little calmer. So this is one opportunity to think about like, okay, what happened in this year plus after January 8th, which was our January 6th, as many of you will know, and
it was a time lag of 2 days.
Exactly, 2 years and 2 days. That was it. Exactly. Or jet lag, yeah. So and to kind of think about what has happened, and I think fundamentally also about starting from this set of events, right, which was, I would say, as shocking. I think January 6th is really like a good comparison in terms of like what it represented, just like how shocking the events were, even though, and it's been kind of a refrain for Brazil as for the US lately, like they were not necessarily surprising, even though they were indeed quite shocking. And as you can see, like really, like the level of destruction, like at the very heart of the key institutions of power in Brazil, which are all located around the same square in the capital, and that's kind of where the whole thing happened. So in other words, like after a year after this, right? I think it's worth thinking about what happened, but also What did not happen, right? Also, what did not happen at that time, and here the refrain is "não teve golpe," like which is like there was no coup, right? The coup, I mean, there was an attempted coup, but the coup was not successful, but it could have been, right? And a couple of things I think that we want to think about to kind of try and understand what it means that it did not succeed, what it means that things that have then calmed down. So I would say that the acute, and it was very acute, right, threat to democracy has been contained, unlike in some other countries across the Atlantic that we might think of. Brazil has actually dealt with this situation quite well, right? I think the politics has been surprisingly stable over this year, again, like boring in a way that was, I think, surprising. And these dogs that don't bark, like we need to pay attention to that, right? And not just, we need to think about the things that are, as maybe the economist jargon would say, kind of off the equilibrium path, like the things that don't happen but could have happened, and condition the things that actually happened, right? And I think these two last things out there is that are related, right? The economy has done surprisingly well, and I think that relates to some deft management by some key players in the Lula administration, and also, as usual, to some good luck in terms of external factors going our way, and that has helped shore up the politics. But I think it's quite notable that in the aftermath of January 8th, unlike in the United States, where January 6th happened, and now we're kind of back with the same politician, like well positioned to compete for becoming president again. Whereas in Brazil, what happened since then is that Bolsonaro was banned from running in elections for the next 8 years. And I think there are some institutional features that help explain why that happened. Like we have an independent electoral court, which was actually made that judgment. But I think fundamentally, one key factor that differentiates Brazil in that regard is that we have always had very weak political parties. And that has been a blessing for Brazilian democracy at this stage, right? Because what happened, if you contrast with the US, which I think is very useful, what happened in the US is that when Donald Trump kind of takes control of one of the major parties, right, and holds control of that party, I think fundamentally by being able to threaten credibly to blow up the party if it doesn't get his way, right? And every single Republican politician would be like, he can destroy pretty much every single Republican politician, like individually. And because there's no such a thing as the Republican Party in Brazil, Bolsonaro just doesn't hold this power over any political player, right? So he's still a politically significant figure in the sense that he has influence over a sizable number of voters, right? So he will be someone that whose support will be courted and so on and so forth. But fundamentally, none of the political players has to be afraid of him. So everyone was fine with just him being, jettisoned essentially, from the electoral picture, and was actually kind of happy about it. So I think that helps us understand that some of the underlying frailties that are still present in the political system have also helped, right? So I think that is I forgot to switch to that. No, that's fine. So I think that is a key. So I should just go back to the previous. To the Bolsonaro. Yeah, this one. Mm-hmm. So that is, I think, one key factor that has enabled Brazil to deal with that in a more effective way, I would say. So it may sound paradoxical, but I think one institutional feature that would usually be thought of as being kind of a weakness of the Brazilian political system, right? This idea that the parties are very weak, they don't represent, they don't have a big connection with voters, with, you know, the PT, Lula's party being kind of an exception to that. But that I think was a crucial element to help Brazil navigate this situation in a way that other places in a similar context have not, right? Now, but to understand what has happened, so this kind of this helps us understand what hasn't happened in terms of like the situation not, you know, deteriorating further from where we were in January 8th. But I think it helps us to understand what has happened, to think about some of the key characters that have played a role, I think, in Lula's administration and sort of in Brazilian politics over this period. And if sometimes you look at you know, maybe social media or whatever, you would think that the key characters have been Lula and his wife, Janja, who, you know, is very present on social media and like people like to either love her or hate her. But I think these are not the key characters. Even Lula, surprisingly, hasn't necessarily been like, I mean, obviously he is still kind of the commanding presence in Brazilian politics and so on. But I think a lot of what's been going on is better understood with reference to some other key characters there. And the first one is Fernando Haddad, who is the Minister of Finance, Minister of the Economy in Brazil. And I think he has been a key feature in why the Brazilian economy has actually done pretty well. It did better than had been predicted, right? So people were expecting growth more kind of on the order of like 1% or something, and it was like more like 3%, if I'm not mistaken, something around that. And some of that was due to there being like, you know, a terrible harvest in Argentina, great harvest in Brazil, prices went up, like Brazil kind of had a big year kind of on the agricultural sector that really pushed the economy. But he negotiated or navigated what could have been sort of a perilous situation, especially because the fiscal side was quite complicated, because coming out of COVID, the Bolsonaro administration sort of had managed to keep the fiscal situation sort of from exploding, even while they were like spending a lot of money, like in trying to get him reelected, by savagely like cutting everything else, right? And then the PT like would not like and could not kind of like stand for that, and something had to be, you know, they wouldn't be able to contain the situation that way. And he actually managed to you know, negotiate through Congress like at least a sketch of a fiscal framework that has made people and investors kind of more has quieted down some of the fears that things might get out of hand. I mean, there's still questions as to whether he will be able to deliver on some of that, and it's really largely revenue based and not based on like cutting spending. And the Brazilian government obviously like spends quite a lot, but I think he really managed to keep expectations from getting out of hand, right? And he has been like the key political negotiator to get things done in Congress, much more so than Lula actually, which I think is sort of an interesting fact. Now, the other key player on the economic side is this guy here, Roberto Campos Neto, RCN, as we call him in Brazil, who is the governor of the central bank, and who's been like in the news a lot because Lula is like Lula's favorite villain, because the central bank became autonomous under Bolsonaro, and he was nominated by Bolsonaro, but his term goes into like another year after this. So that was kind of the idea of having like this unaligned terms of the president and the governor of the central bank. And inflation in Brazil shot up with the rest of the world, especially in like 2022. But the Brazilian central bank was really ahead of the curve in like raising interest rates and kind of keeping that under control. Now interest rates went up a lot, and like Lula complained about that, like, you know, vociferously, and he would really point at RCN and kind of say like, this guy, you know, like is terrible, and so on and so forth. But then inflation did fall, right? And that's been a big bonus for Lula, right? because as all of us, I think at this point have learned with the experience in the US, and because, people in the US or Europe haven't dealt with inflation in a long time, and inflation in Latin America has always been kind of there, not as much as in other places. And I'm looking at Guido right there, but still, like, Brazilians obviously have experience with inflation and kind of traumatic experience, and he really, I think, was a key player in holding and bringing inflation down, and in doing so, really kind of enabling this favorable economic scenario that ended up happening. So I think the two of them kind of together, and they play along like fairly well. I think they were key players in delivering economic results that have enabled things to calm down on the political front, right? So I think these are two of the key characters. Next. Now, and especially Haddad did that in a partnership with these two other guys here, which is Arthur Lira, who is the Speaker of the House, like the chairman of the House of Deputies, and Rodrigo Pacheco, who is the President of the Senate. And they were key players because one thing that I think is very important to understand about Brazil, not only now but going forward, is that the political equilibrium that existed over, like, since redemocratization, which is one where the executive was sort of the leading agent, right? They held agenda power, they pushed things through Congress, buying off legislators as needed. And this has completely, or this has basically collapsed over the last 10 years or so, because for a number of reasons, Congress has acquired a lot more control over the budget, right? And especially under Bolsonaro, who basically kind of abdicated from governing, like in a number of dimensions, and kind of outsourced it to Congress. And then Congress was like, wow, like, we like that. Like, we like being able to, instead of getting the crumbs that the executive would give us, we actually now go straight to the source, right? So everything that happens has to now be negotiated in a situation where Congress is in a much more powerful position, right? And I think we haven't figured out what the new equilibrium is, because then the Supreme Court is very often called into the picture to kind of, make political decisions or policy decisions, I should say. And then there's a lot of tension between Congress and the court, and the government is sort of caught in the middle of all of that. So I think we no longer have the old equilibrium. It's also like the old has died, but the new is not yet born. And there's this underlying instability in the political system, which I think is economically very important, because it's a situation where there is no constituency for cutting the budget, right? There's like just pressure for kind of expanding, spending more and more. And that is something that, Haddad is trying to kind of figure out by raising revenues, but there's only so much that you can do with that, right? And they've managed to do some very important things. I think from a long run perspective, they managed to pass tax reform, which had been discussed in Brazil like for probably 500 years, and they managed to pass it. And it's still, they pass it, but it's only going to start being implemented in like however many years. It's like it's a long process, so it's still. But it's been a major policy accomplishment, right? Brazil had a completely insane like tax system, and now it's bound to be a lot less insane and a lot more in line with what like most functional countries do. So there's been a lot done, but I think there's a fundamental instability here that I think is very important. And to kind of finish off and moving a little bit away from the economic side and bringing in some other policy dimensions that I think have been quite important and showcase some potential and some challenges and risks that Brazil faces. I think these are three key players as well. So on the left is Marina Silva, who is like the Minister for the Environment. And I highlight that because I think this was the policy area where there's been the biggest change from Bolsonaro, right? This is like 180 degrees. Right? It's like having a government pretty much literally committed to environmental degradation and destruction to a government that is actually trying to, do something about the environment, which I think has a lot of economic importance, because I think there's a lot of potential in terms of like green economy, and I think Brazil is in a position that could receive a lot of investment. If you think about Brazil as the energy pattern, the energy consumption pattern of Brazil would be like a model country for the world in terms of like climate change, because it's sustainable sources through like hydro. Now Brazil is doing a lot more solar, wind. The whole problem is that deforestation, does away like with all of that. So environment is a key aspect, obviously, like from the world perspective, is very important. People care a lot about, and I think there's a lot of good stuff that is happening here. Now, the other two are, I think, the LVPs, like the least valuable players in the government, in two ways. So the guy on the right is Celso Amorim, who is Lula's advisor for foreign policy, and I'll let Alessandro get to that, but I'm just foreshadowing my opinion on what they've been doing. And this guy in the middle is José Múcio, who is the defense minister, and he symbolizes the track that the Lula administration chose, which is to accommodate with the military. So the military was lying behind like a lot of the threat that Bolsonaro represented. Like there was really like Bolsonaro brought the military into the government, and it was really kind of pushing for the military to intervene after the election and so on. And José Múcio, who is the defense minister, was really like the guy trying to accommodate things, and accommodate by conceding to the military, right? And basically kind of keeping the military happy by giving them what they want. And I think Lula fundamentally chose to pursue that, but that has kept the military as kind of like holding this off the equilibrium threat that they hold just to get more stuff, right? So there's, they're like, yeah, we're not going to do anything, but like there's some crazy people like out there, like better not mess around like with, and that kind of stuff. And Lula has just been showering them with money, but I think that has not dealt with the fundamental challenge that Brazil hasn't dealt with like over the last 35 years since the democratization, and that we've seen with Bolsonaro that is still very real, right? So I think if things deteriorate, and then maybe like we go to my conclusion, which is things are boring, which is good, right? I think it's better than certainly they could have been, and I think like it's better than I perhaps expected them to be on a number of dimensions. But there are these underlying frailties, right? One is this idea that institutions are still out of equilibrium, right? Congress, like you have that not quite balanced out. The military is still very much, now they're not an active threat as they were under Bolsonaro and until, January 8th, but that is still, they're still holding that card, right? And if things deteriorate in 2026, and we might have a different configuration in the US, for instance, that might have changed things. Like in 2022, it was important that the US immediately after the election recognize Lula's victory. They signaled before the election, and this has come out after that, that they were very clear in telling the military and telling, it's like, look, we're not going to stand, behind any crazy stuff, right? So they were really like a bulwark. And I'm not saying that they were like the pivotal factor, but they were important, right? And if in 2026 someone else is in the White House, it could be a different situation, right? And I think in that context, there are economic risks as well to balance some of the opportunities, right? I think that idea of green investment and the green economy as being like an opportunity for Brazil is there, but there is still like a big constituency for environmental destruction in Brazil, right? It's like especially in the Amazon, right? Where there's a lot of people kind of more wedded to a model where exploitation is the thing to do, right? And Bolsonaro is very much kind of a representative of that. The fiscal situation, I think, is still fragile, right? It's kind of contained in terms of like the critical aspect of it, but it's still these underlying forces that I think pushing towards or against like a fiscal consolidation, and remains to be seen how that plays out. And to a large extent, I think like Brazil has been sustained economically by the dynamism of the agricultural sector, what Brazil now we call the agro. And can they keep this going? I think it's an open question as well. And in the context where I think there are these underlying political risks, which again are a little bit dormant now, which is great, right? Again, like we should not take for granted, because we could be in a much worse situation, but they're still there, and that's kind of like my picture in a nutshell. I think Brazil is better than I thought it would be at this point, and I think there are opportunities like going in the future, but there are still these risks, and so it's boring, but not entirely boring. Might be just a lull in the movie before things get back again. But I'll stop here, and we can come back later.
Thank you so much, Dean Campante. And I want to say, for a boring topic, it was a really non-boring presentation. So thank you very much for that. Our next presentation will be by Alessandro Merli, who's here as an associate fellow at SAIS Europe. He's also an adjunct professor at the Bologna Business School. He's had many awards for journalism excellence, particularly for his work in Brazil. He has also lived in Brazil and received the Order of the Southern Cross from the President of Brazil. So it is from his personally. Yeah. So for that,
cool.
oh, thank you very much. We have someone here to help me get his presentation up. So thank you, Alessandro.
Thank you, Jackie. I have to mention that we had a very similar meeting a year ago, right after January 8th, and with Jackie and myself and Professor Pasquino, and I can tell you that there were a lot more worried faces then, as Filipe mentioned, than there are now, although, the undercurrents are not totally calm. But then, there were a lot more question marks at the time, and people were definitely a lot more worried. What I'm going to talk about briefly is about the Brazil's foreign policy under Lula, and maybe touch on the topics that Filipe has already mentioned. And I'll start with a comparison with Lula 1 or Lula 1 and 2, which were the years where he was in power between 2003 and 2010, and what's going on now. And at the time, Barack Obama said that Lula was the most popular politician on earth, which is quite something, I think. And it was actually a time where there was this honeymoon between Lula and a lot of the other world leaders, and Brazil was on the up. The BRICS were born. It's a bit of a fiction, because it put together this acronym put together by Jim O'Neill of Goldman Sachs, put together Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. It's a bit of a mess, but anyway, they had a role to play, and especially they had a role within the G20, which at the time was quite active. And they played a role, for instance, in the finding the solutions to the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. They were very active players then. Also, internally, Lula was benefiting from the commodities boom that came with, the entrance of China in the world economy. China was importing a lot of the commodities that Brazil exports, and that created also a boom in the Brazilian economy, which benefited Lula and his popularity. So when Lula was re-elected and took power at the beginning of last year, first thing he proclaimed is Brazil is back. Like, we're now turning the clock back to the good times when I was president on my first and second mandate. And the other thing Lula wanted to make clear from the very start to his fellow world leader is that I'm not Bolsonaro. So the main message was, I'm not Bolsonaro. I will be involved in foreign policy Bolsonaro was very much isolationist. There is the saying that the only foreign leader that he spoke to were Trump and the Hungarian Viktor Orban, which is to say something. And also, I'm not Bolsonaro in any way. So that made everybody else kind of breathe a sigh of relief, because people didn't quite get along very well with Bolsonaro. The problem is, and I have a quote here, not from Obama, but from The Wizard of Oz, which most of you are too old to have seen, maybe too young to have seen. And at some point, Dorothy is catapulted in the new realm, and she says to her dog, Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore. Well, Lula, I tell you what, you're not in the world of 2003, 2010 anymore. So what were the references to his foreign policy, which were basically trying to be equidistant in a multipolar world between the US and China, and also the BRICS, there were two main tenets, are much more difficult to navigate in this new world. Why? Because two things have happened. One is obviously the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we'll come to that in a second. And the other one is that in this multipolar world, the relationship between the US and China has become an open confrontation. So it has become very difficult to try and be equidistant without taking the part of one or the other. And the big dream of Lula is that we're going to enter a new world order, but he risks getting to this new world order as a kind of second fiddle to China rather than on his own merit. So this is the new world that Lula finds himself in. I'm not sure he realizes that or not, that the world has changed around him, but he has had a few reality checks in the past year or so. If we go to the next slide, yes. So the main factor of change was the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that made a big change in many ways, because this idea of Brazil that could stand in a kind of neutral position, and even Lula offered itself as a mediator between Ukraine and Russia. Of course, that was not very believable, because from the very start, this kind of non-neutrality, appeared strange, because while he was offering himself as a mediator, Lula at the same time was attacking Ukraine, saying that Ukraine and Russia were both responsible for the war, saying that the US and Europe had actually were instrumental in provoking the war. That he partially retracted that, but of course, after having said that, it's kind of difficult to propose yourself as the mediator in this situation. So much so that, of course, Zelensky, Ukrainians never took seriously the proposal from Lula to become the mediator in the story. Some political scientists in Brazil said, well, why is Lula getting involved in this? That is something that he knows nothing about. And, he has shown himself that he's aligned with one of the two parts. So why would he do that? And one thing, one of the characters that were shown by Filipe in his slides is it's Celso Amorim, who used to be Lula's foreign minister in his first two mandates, and is now his main foreign policy advisor, and Lula listens to him very much. And Amorim is a very good friend, has formed this very good relationship with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and he plays on that a lot, and that makes Brazil a very unlikely mediator between the parts. They've received Lavrov at the height of the crisis with all honors. Lula said that there is a G20 this year. Brazil has the rotating presidency. He said, well, after the pronouncement of the International Criminal Court, that Putin maybe indicted. He said, well, he can come to Brazil anytime he wants. We're not going to do that, anything to him. So there is this problem, objective problem. But then this non-neutrality, maybe explained by these political factors, but it also as a big economic component, and it's already been mentioned here, the importance of the agricultural sector in Brazil. That's about 1/3 of the economy. That's much more than in most advanced economy. Not only that, but the agro lobby is very powerful in Congress and in very fragmented Congress. And as Filipe has already said, I mean, they really exert this power. And Russia is a very important exporter to fertilizers to Brazil, which depends on Russian fertilizers very much. And the other element is that, in spite of the fact that Brazil is a big energy producer itself, it imports a lot of diesel and a lot of fuel oil from Russia. Actually, these imports have skyrocketed in the past year. There was an article, I think it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, in the Financial Times showing that the import of diesel from Russia has increased by 4,600%, which is an absurd number for diesel, and fuel oil also 400,000. So these are huge numbers, but the decision, we could not say that was entirely political or was not mostly political. I mean, the fact is that Brazil is getting these fuels at a very deep discount after the sanctions and the situation in the market. So the price actually matters. There is a discount factor that is very important. You have to remember that Brazil, of course, is a continent, and a lot of goods in Brazil, in a much higher proportion than in other countries, move around in trucks. And these trucks, of course, depend for moving on diesel, and Brazil doesn't produce so much diesel itself, in spite of the fact that it produces oil. And so it imports a lot from Russia, and now it's importing a lot from Russia at a very discounted price. So that played an important role also in this relationship with Russia. The other phase is the relationship with China, that is also very relevant. And China is responsible for not only the Brazil boom of the beginning of the millennium, but also this continuing or returning boom more recently. China is the biggest trading partner of Brazil. Its trade with Brazil is 3 times that of the US, just to give you a measure. The US are still the biggest foreign investor, I think, in Brazil, but China is also catching up, investing especially in the commodities areas, mineral, and all that. So China has also become, for a number of years now, a very, very important partner for Brazil. Also, there are other factors that may be considered minor, but maybe are not so minor. The creation of this BRICS bank in the mind of Lula is something that can create a sort of an antagonist to the Bretton Woods institution, because operating through the BRICS bank, which is based in China, and where as president it was installed the Lula successor as president, Dilma Rousseff, which was spectacularly unsuccessful as a president in terms of economic matters. But anyway, Brazil was able to install her at the head of this bank. So that also is a factor that played a little bit in these considerations. Also, Brazil likes the idea that we should find alternatives to the dollar as the main international currency. And of course, that's an idea that pleases the Chinese very much, which just have thought for a number of years that they should have a wider international role for the renminbi. Then a collateral to that is that the ludicrous idea that there should be a common currency for Latin America, or at least for the Mercosur, which is, my view at the moment, totally inapplicable, and would be anyway totally against the interest of Brazil at the moment. But anyway, so that is one aspect that is very important, the relationship with China. The problem with the relationship with China that is not balanced as it was at the beginning of the millennium, the first two Lula mandates, but China has now become so big and so powerful, such an important actor in international relationship, and its relations with the US in particular has changed so radically since then that it's hard to see Brazil playing a sort of equivalent role to China. They will at this point, they will inevitably be a kind of, second fiddle to China. If we go to the next slide, so what's foreign policy under Lula? How it will develop? There were a number of tags that were put to it. There was this old non-aligned movement in the, I think, 50s and 60s of the developing countries which wanted to, not be aligned with Russia and not be aligned with the US. And some political scientists in Brazil have defined Lula's policy as a kind of active non-alignment or pragmatic autonomy from the two big blocs. Another term that's become very popular now that is kind of replaced the BRICS is the term of the global south, right? The global south is now going to be this big player in international politics. Now, of course, there are less complementary views of what Lula is doing. The Economist has written an article saying that he's hyperactive and in foreign policy, and is a bit naive if he thinks that China will actually cater to his interest. And there's also this undertone of anti-Western rhetoric, which was seen in the case of the Russia-Ukraine episode. There's also the role that Brazil wants to play in Latin America, which is sometimes at odds even with other left-wing governments in Latin America. For instance, you know about the refugees crisis in Venezuela, or the people that fled Venezuela because they fled the Maduro economic hardship and the Maduro dictatorship. And at some point, Lula and his administration kind of hinted that this was all fake news, right? This is a narrative that people want us to believe, that no such thing is happening. And another left-wing president in Latin America, just elected, the Chilean president Boric, said, "What? This is all bullshit. This is actually happening. We have thousands, if not millions, of people coming through our borders, coming from Venezuela." So, Lula likes to think himself as a sort of deus ex machina or superior figure or primus inter pares of the Latin American left, but not necessarily everybody agrees. Then, of course, there is the challenge posed by the new government in Argentina, because the old government were very much aligned with Lula, but not that brought many concrete results. Of course, here we have Professor Adleris, which could tell a lot more about that. But I think Lula and Milei started trading insults, basically. By trading insults, and then Lula didn't go to inaugurate. This whole dynamics, started very badly. Now it seems that they probably realize the two countries are next to each other. They will have to come to some arrangement. They will need to talk to each other in some form or another. And for instance, the Milei government seems to be, again, Guido will be a lot more knowledgeable than I am about this, seem to be more involved, for instance, in the Mercosur United European Union negotiations than the previous government was. And so this is a big question mark, because, of course, Milei is a bit unpredictable. Who don't know what they're thinking of his entourage in these terms, and Lula is a bit prickly in this in this context. So we will have to see how these things develop. There are a couple of more points that I want to touch on before leaving the floor. One is that the question of trade. You have to remember that Brazil has a very strong protectionist tradition that is inspired by two things. One is the Foreign Service, Itamaraty, was traditionally protectionist, and the other one is especially the industrial establishment in São Paulo, which is the industrial powerhouse in the country. And they were traditionally very, very protectionist. So even in multilateral discussions, the various WTO discussion, they tended to be more on the breaking side, together with India. But that doesn't seem to be a problem now because everybody's a protectionist, the US, the Europe. And so, you know, they're kind of aligned with everybody else in that respect. On the trade side, the hottest issue or the most, you know, present issue is the question of the negotiation between Mercosur and the European Union, which has dragged on for years and years and years. And at some point, it seemed to be moving, it seemed to be going somewhere. The problem is that it has now become a political problem on this side of the Atlantic as well. It has become a political football, for instance, in the recent spat between the Macron government in France and the farmers who are protesting. So it's hard to think that at this point France will give the green light to this without, you know, some arrangement for its farmers. So I think that it's probably going to be on hold as well. Last point, the environment has already been touched by Filipe, is very important also in terms of foreign policy. It's important in terms of domestic policy, but it's also important in terms of foreign policy, because that's where Brazil had shown during the first two Lula mandates and is showing now that can be a reliable partner to the its main counterparts in the international arena. Also, they hold the G20 presidency this year, so the best card that they can put on the table is actually see, we're going to do something about the environment. We're a big player here because of the Amazon and all that. And so we're a reliable partner, and they can kind of use this card maybe to get something in return, or any way to make progress on the environmental side. And I think a lot of people in Brazil think that instead of, you know, dreaming about being the mediator on Ukraine or the new global order or stuff like that, Lula would be better off concentrating on stuff that he knows he can do, he's shown he can do, like this environmental stuff. I'll leave it here and I'll leave it.
Thank you, Alessandro. And I really appreciate what a different talk this is than a year ago about where things stand. I'm Professor Jackie Mazza. I am just going to add a few smaller comments that complement my two colleagues' presentations in the areas that I'm teaching all of you this semester. That is U.S. foreign policy towards Brazil and labor markets and social policy. So we're likely going to try to see if I can get someone back to bring up my presentation. Come on in. Perfect
Right on
timing.
cue, yeah.
I was So I'm just going to start, and Alessandro has really mentioned the key topics on U.S. foreign policy to the region. That is, they're very similar to the big global foreign policy issues. And I wanted to start with the first meeting that is right after Lula comes in.
Oh, the other one, sorry.
Okay. Right after Lula comes in, what we have is what we have is a quick meeting. I'll just start from this slide. Yeah, perfect. So I like this picture because Joe Biden doesn't always look like the more awake one in the room when it comes to a foreign leader, but they are in February 2023. We like to call this the sort of post-January 6th and 8th therapy session, because Lula comes up less than a month after January 8th, and there really is this kind of shared experience on facing, assaults to their relative capitals. And because of this meeting, there was a big talk at the moment about a reset of U.S.-Brazilian relations, particularly from the Bolsonaro-Trump years. And we're going to have to remember that the Bolsonaro-Trump years were not great benefits to Brazil. What was the greatest benefit was this ideological populist alignment, and particularly the Bolsonaro getting a total silent pass from the United States on the environmental degradation of the Amazon. That is, no, it's not happening under President Biden, but in a similar way that we talk about Mexico, that is, the alignments of AMLO with Trump and Bolsonaro with Trump were more about more domestic room for them to do things that normally the United States might be highly critical of. So if we just, and really Alessandro has gone through most of these, but from the US standpoint, clearly, and from his recommendation, clearly the support for environmental policies is probably the biggest change in US policy. In theory, the U.S. has committed to $500 million to the Amazon Fund. If the Norwegians have given a lot more, but we don't know. It's the U.S. Congress, so can the U.S. really fulfill this? Finally, the U.S. is now supporting the expansion of the UN Security Council. This is something Lula wanted when he was at his first term, and this January 6th and 8th solidarity really does have a kind of kinship between the two. And interesting that Brazil is much further along, as Filipe had mentioned, than the United States in disassociating a candidate from insurrection from running again. But on the foreign policy, just in the same way that we might be critical of Lula's kind of messes on the foreign policy scene, it has really affected its relations with the United States. The neutrality on Ukraine has been probably the biggest issue for the United States, because the United States would have wanted Brazil to join in on the military coalition. And, Lula says, well, we're only for peace, we're not for war. And so it really is a problem. The mess of the enlargement of BRICS, that was a win for China. And, Brazil, in its previous Lula presidency, had been the main supporter of the running the UN operation in Haiti. They were asked by the United States to take over, and ultimately the United States had to move to Kenya as the leader of the new Haiti security mission. Just to add a little bit on labor markets. So labor markets are actually, considering the rest of Latin America, pretty good. Both the number of unemployed have fell. Unemployment rates, it's when you talk about they're less than double digits now in Brazil. And I like this graph here from Bloomberg, because they really attribute the declines or the improvements in the job market to these economic reforms that Filipe was talking about. That is, we can see these positive domestic developments and what that translates into the labor market. And it's not just more people discouraged in the labor market. We have both the decreasing number of unemployed and increasing labor force participation in Brazil. We still have the big problems in Brazil: stagnant labor productivity. The agricultural sector, in terms of productivity, is really improving, but 90% of the workforce is in services and manufacturing. Still a fundamental problem in human capital and the quality of education, essentially higher education for the rich. And how can Brazil recoup the human capital losses from the pandemic. This is true of all of Latin America, and the estimates from the UN, it could be from 1 to 13 years to get back to pre-pandemic human capital levels. What I wanted to talk about just at the end is kind of electoral politics over social policy, because we didn't see it as clearly as we did in the use of the changes in the conditional cash transfer program. And here, the Auxílio Brasil was introduced by Bolsonaro, and remember, Bolsa Familia was what Lula's sort of crowning program in his first administration. And what we find is that during the pandemic, typical in Latin America, sort of change the name of the program when it's yours. But in the case of Bolsonaro, he changed it quite substantially. That Auxílio Brasil was not a renaming of the conditional cash transfer program. They took out the conditionality and they greatly increased the numbers. Now, most countries in Latin America did something similar. Brazil did the most increase in the cash transfer, but most countries, because of the pandemic, had to eliminate the conditionality. People weren't going to schools, they weren't going to clinics. The difference in Brazil was that the Auxílio Brasil, when it evolved into something that was, post-pandemic quite different. That is, they kept off the requirements for schooling and for health, and they made guarantees these higher levels of monthly benefits. And in fact, in December of 22, just at a particular point in time, there was a constitutional amendment to formally increase the benefit from 400, which was already an increase from about 250 reais to 600. So you're going to see that as the election gets closer, as at that point, we had a moment when Bolsonaro was a good 15 points behind Lula. We have a significant increase in the number of beneficiaries, plus an increase in the average benefit. The way they did it, in the same way that Filipe talked about the decrease in other government spending, they decreased the spending on other social services. So health services, prenatal care. So as a result, the supplemental services that used to be part of the Bolsa Familia family really didn't exist anymore, and social policy became the single income transfer mostly. So there were 67 million beneficiaries during the pandemic. Again, most countries tripled the number of beneficiaries. But it is the sort of keeping on when they brought it down to 14 million in 2021 and increased it sort of even later in the pandemic. That is the electoral period, July to December 2022, there was, again, the formal increase in the benefit level and expansion to other people. What many say is that, when we talk about something, the fiscal costs of this change grew quite substantially. That is, from 0.5 GDP in 2019 to 4% of GDP during the pandemic to 2022, still 1.2% of the GDP, which is pretty unsustainable. It was done to show, in essence, they said to curry favor with Lula's typical voters. Lula announces that he's going to keep this unsustainable level of 600 reais, and then but he's going to return to what he's calling the new Bolsa Familia. And just to look a little bit about what happened under the Auxílio, what we had is these budget cuts for health and services and an increase in inequalities. Basically, took away the extra amount for young children and for old children. So the smallest families did really well with this 600 monthly benefit. A lot of what, in World Bank terms is called leakage happened. That is, the data was old. Data wasn't collected during the pandemic. And then people were added to the rolls that once they got jobs after the pandemic didn't in essence, get removed from the program. So what we have essentially was a whole lot of people that probably shouldn't have been getting Bolsa Familia, and this is what Lula complained about. Basically, he complains that there was massive fraud under Bolsonaro and that there were benefits given, these little payments to the middle and high class, and nobody was looking at them. Partially, it was because the data systems didn't keep up. So what Lula does is he pretty much keeps his promise. He keeps that 600 level. He restores the conditions for youth going to school and for mothers seeking prenatal care. He increases the benefits so that larger families do get more money. But he is still at that same problem that Filipe mentioned, which is he's got a huge fiscal load from social policy. And he's, proposing maybe we can have a constitutional amendment to permanently exempt social spending, which probably wouldn't like the IMF probably wouldn't like too much. But we can see that what Lula does is he keeps the number of beneficiaries at these high levels, and he keeps, but he in essence tries to clean up the rolls. What we have then is a really good example of social benefits being involved in electoral politics, and I just add that to our discussion. So I want to open up now to all of you. We'll start with a couple of questions from students. Introduce yourselves, and we'll go from there. Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Mazza and Professor Campante and Professor Merli for your interesting presentations. I'm Brazilian myself. It's nice to see a fellow Brazilian in Campante. There are not many of us at SAIS, at least here at SAIS Europe, from São Paulo. And I had a lot of questions, but I'll stick to two. I would like first to ask a question on economic policy, more related to what Dean Campante talked about in the beginning, and when you talked about the Minister of the Economy, Haddad's relative fiscal restraint and internal critical voices from his own party, from the PT, and sort of in an interesting comparison. Obviously, Haddad himself is a historical member of this party, but last year his economic policy was even I wouldn't say praised, but sort of even the former economy minister Paulo Guedes, under Haddad in a private meeting, said he wasn't doing such a bad job. And in an interesting parallel, sort of, I see Haddad as a new Palocci in a parallel to Lula's first administration. But of course, we know after Palocci came Guido Mantega, and there are internal voices in the PT, like the PT president, Hopkins, who's been calling for a more expansionary fiscal policy in the lead up to the 2026 election, also to play into the party's sort of political interests. So I was wondering if you can comment on that, and if you expect the Minister of Economy, because when he was appointed, obviously many people saw that move from Lula as positioning Haddad to be a future candidate and to carry the Lula's mantle. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on that internal strife, and if we can expect, if you expect Haddad to stay in command of the Brazilian economy, or if we can expect, something like that. And then if I could add a quick question on foreign policy, when you talked about challenges with the U.S. relationship, and I guess Western powers in general, I was surprised Brazil's position on the current Israel-Hamas war wasn't mentioned, because of course Lula has made some questionable statements in that area, and Brazil recently formally joined South Africa in its ICJ bid accusing Israel of committing genocide. So I was wondering also if you could comment on that and how that has an impact in the relationship to the U.S. in particular, but more broadly to the West.
Well, we have a lot of good questions there, so I'm gonna let one or two more students add, and then we'll go from there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Amelia. I'm from Minnesota in the US. I'm a first year Myers student. This is a bit of a two-part question related to the expansion of the BRICS or coalition here. So it was recently confirmed that 1 new countries will be joining the BRICS. How do you see the addition of these countries affecting Brazil's economy? And on the political side, how do you see the relationship that Brazil has with the US being affected, particularly by the joining of Iran?
I think that's enough to even start.
Okay.
I mean, I always laugh because when I, in a typical Latin American forum, you gather questions so you can decide which ones you don't want to answer. But here in an academic forum, we answer all the questions. No, there were a lot there.
Yeah, no. So thanks for the questions. And when you said my name, when you pronounced my name, I was like, wow, people are studying Portuguese hard. Like that was a good Brazilian pronunciation. So I mean, on your question about sort of the internal strife and the PT, and I mean, Haddad has been subject to an extraordinary amount of like friendly fire, so to speak, right? Like people from the PT kind of complaining about fiscal policy and sort of that degree of fiscal restraint, which I'll call it kind of a fiscal restraint coming from the left, right? Because it's really like trying to raise revenues and so on, but still he's gotten a lot of friendly fire. And I think, you know, it's especially the people who are my friends who are maybe not super sympathetic to PT would point out that like, oh, Gleisi Hoffmann this, which is the president of the PT and like whatnot. And then it is like fundamentally like Haddad is the guy who Lula chose to be the Minister of Finance, right? So it's like Lula, I think, is still like a very pragmatic guy. And that is the message that I take from this, how things have played out. And that wasn't necessarily obvious because I think over time, and especially after he went to prison, right? And I think that kind of changed, I think, him in like certain ways and made him perhaps, you would have thought maybe less pragmatic on a certain number of fronts. But in the end, like, the guys making decisions are Haddad and his team. So, and I think that happens because Lula is just, he's not a fool, right? He's really like, and he knows that the worst thing that could possibly happen is like inflation getting out of control, right? And I think he understands the like where his political bread is buttered. So I would predict that like there will still be a lot of friendly fire as elections approach, even this year when we have municipal elections in Brazil, which are a big deal politically speaking. There will be pressure for like trying to, you know, turn on the spigots and so on. But if I were to bet, I would say like I would definitely see like Haddad remaining like the key figure in the government. And while I still think Lula will run for re-election because he, you know, has a kind of a unique presence, even though he will be like quite old, like we know now from the US that, you know, age is just a number, right? But I think Haddad like kind of looks like the guy who might take over afterwards, which then will lead to all sorts of different political problems because he's not Lula. There's lots of, you know, ideological divergence within the party and so on. But for now, I think you'll kind of stay on the same path. That would be my prediction on that. So I'll let the other questions, like you guys take them on.
Alessandro, did you want to talk about the BRICS and the Israeli Hamas?
Yeah, I just add one word to what Filipe just said is that in terms of Lula being pragmatic, in his first mandate, he actually replaced another pragmatic, whom you mentioned, Antonio Palocci was his finance minister then, not because he wanted to replace Palocci, but because Palocci was involved in a scandal that made him quit or was impossible not to have him removed. So, and then, yeah, of course, there was this change of fiscal policy completely, first with Mantega and then in the whole disastrous Dilma Rousseff handling of fiscal accounts. And the other thing is, in terms of Lula's pragmatism, is that Lula, from the very start of his first mandate, understood that inflation hurts the poor, who are his electors. That's a message that not a lot of people on the left, even in Europe, have understood. I mean, there's always a lot of clamoring for more expansion, more this and more that. And the idea that inflation hurts first and foremost the poor, that's something that Lula got into his head at the very beginning of his first mandate. I mean, he had some wobble there with his attacks on the central banks, but it was more because probably the autonomy was granted by Bolsonaro than for anything else. But he understands this. So that's just to complete. Well, the BRICS enlargement, I mean, Jack, you can talk about, what it means to the U.S. relationship as well as the question on Hamas and all that. The BRICS enlargement has no meaningful or no direct influence on economic relationship between these countries, right? It's more of a sort of political gesturing. It's not that trade between the BRICS, the original BRICS, increased because they were in the BRICS. I mean, or maybe one could say that the BRICS were created because all this economic movement was already happening in terms of trade, for instance, in Brazil and China. Of course, the presence of some countries which are not quite likable for the West will be another irritant, as it will be this question of South Africa and all that in the relationship with the West. And there is the additional matter of Argentina, who had said they would be interested in the old, formulation or with the old government, and now saying that they want to have no part with it. So that is also something that I think should be kept in mind. I think Argentina is probably going to play a little bit of a different game. Again, I defer to Gil Sanleris there. I mean, they want to play maybe a little bit of a different game in terms of international relationship and the relationship with the U.S.
Yeah, I just want to add in, it was interesting point about the Israeli-Hamas war. I think the real difference is the discomfort that the U.S. has with its own position on Israel-Hamas war. That is, it isn't in the position of being critical of other countries' position, because it's uncomfortable with its, we want a ceasefire, but we support the Israeli government, blah, blah, blah. And so as a result, you didn't see any of the condemnation of South Africa either. So I think it's, Ukraine is much more concrete for the United States and clear cut. I'm going to open up to some more questions. I think we have to have an Argentine and then, yeah.
Thank you. It was very interesting to hear your presentations. I'm not gonna talk about Argentina. I'm gonna ask you about Brazil.
We'll have another meeting on that.
We leave it for some other
I'm
time.
sure a lot of people will be interested. I would be very interested.
And it's not boring.
Never bored.
I'm curious about the following, Filipe and Alessandro. When one looks at the data on growth, South America is the region of the world probably that has grown the least in the last 50 years, 30 years, 20 years, you pick the period. And you look within that region, which countries were the worst performers, and it's, well, Venezuela in the last 20, 30 years, followed by Argentina, and then Brazil, with very dismal growth rates. When you describe the current, at first, you didn't talk about this long term. What are the reforms? You have to mention 2 or 3 reforms that Brazil would need to grow much faster, and in particular, whether you think Lula administration is working.
So I think, there are some reforms that have been done that I think are positive and that increase, but they will have like a level effect, I would say, right? One of them is labor reform, whiwhich was done under the Temer administration. And I think some of the unemployment results, I mean, there's argument about that, but I think that there's some evidence that this has been sort of a positive change for labor markets, and it's highly controversial and like whatnot, but I think that's kind of one. The other, tax reform, I think, will have an impact, but again, I think it's going to be a level. It's just like reducing inefficiency, right? In both cases. But to grow, as we know, right? Like to grow sustainably, you have to increase productivity, right? And you need to increase productivity growth, right? And that is the challenge. But in some sense, it's like, and that's what has been the case, I think, already for a while. It's the challenge of that a normal economy faces, right? So where you're not like dealing with, prices and, high inflation and like whatever. Well, then what do you need to do? You need to, invest in education. You need to, have, I mean, education is like a huge deal. Like infrastructure in Brazil is like a huge deal. But it's like that kind of work that is what's really needed is kind of inescapable, right? And that's not in the headlines oftentimes, but I think that's the reason why Brazil has performed poorly in terms of growth is because productivity has performed very poorly. Productivity growth outside of agriculture, I would say, as you pointed out, agriculture is the success story in Brazil, and it's been a story of productivity, right? It's not just intensive or sort of extensive margin growth. Like there's some of that, right? Like incorporating land and so on, but even incorporating land has underlying productivity to it, right? Because it's like Brazil has developed new varieties of soybeans that are, better suited for like different kinds of, so all these things. And so in that sense, like Brazil needs to do much more broadly and in areas that actually employ a lot more people, what it has succeeded in doing, like in agriculture and at some level, right? So to the extent that Brazil has been growing, it's been driven by agriculture, right? And that's because it's the sector that has increased productivity. And I think the challenge is to do that in other sectors, but that's hard work.
Go ahead. Yeah, these two questions right now.
Yeah, I should have collected the question.
Yeah, no worries.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. My name is Alex Aparicio. I'm AIR. So obviously a big part of what happened last year was a lack of trust in institutions. And after Lava Jato, there was all that movement to pass reforms, the SOE Act. And I was wondering, because I haven't really heard anything about that since the elections with Bolsonaro, is that at all in the cards to continue to state-owned enterprises, any further reforms? And then my second question, just a quick one, how high on the agenda for the new government is the ascension to the OECD, and is that impacting reforms? Thank you.
Why don't we take another question? I know I'm concentrating on the front, so I'll call on the
there
back
was one at
next.
the back.
Hi,
Okay,
my name is Eitan. I'm also first year. I was really interested. I know, like we talked about, like Brazil's growth in Latin America, but also the relationship between, like, talking about with Argentina, the comments made about Venezuela. So I was kind of just curious about like a two-phase question. What does the future look like for the Lula administration in Brazil in terms of its relationship with its Latin American neighbors? And how does that impact its standing with the Western world, who is definitely not in agreement with some of the stands that the administration has taken, for example, with Maduro or et cetera? Thank you.
and why don't we take someone from the back? Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Gabriel.
Gabriel.
Also at AIR. I was wondering to what extent you think Lula's position vis-a-vis U.S.-China power competition is interest or ideologically based, and to the extent you can comment, like across the region, to what extent that.
Okay. So on the first question, it's quite remarkable how like Lava Jato seemed to be such a momentous, like epochal change in Brazil, and it's just like got completely destroyed and like washed out, and it's just like left nothing basically. Like SOE reforms you're talking about, right? I mean, Lula, they are kind of rolling it back, right? Like they had kind of governance reforms introduced so that you couldn't put politicians in sort of board positions, and now it's all being rolled back, right? And it's like, it's just remarkable how like what seemed like this kind of critical juncture where like things were, it just got completely rolled back. So that's just the reality of it. And I think eventually, like, you know, like I think this was to a large extent the Lava Jato's own fault in terms of like the excesses and I mean, let's not even get into the rest of it, but I think like the problems are still there, right? And they're gonna emerge at some point in the future, I think, right? And I think like we're whistling past the graveyard like a little bit on that front, but it's just quite remarkable how it seems like it's never existed, you know, like at some level. As far as OECD, I think it's like just not a priority like at all. I think like the Lula administration just, they don't, it's not something that they care about. It kind of even like runs against some of the instincts I think that they have, but you know, which Alessandro and Jackie maybe can talk about. And just like one point, and I'll leave the foreign policy aspect to it, but on the economic versus ideological interest, one thing that as Alessandro was talking about that I was taking notes here is that, you know, if you think about Lula's response to Russia, like Bolsonaro was quite Russia favorable, like at the start of the war, right? Was still there. And there was like all the fertilizers angle. And Bolsonaro, who was like extremely anti-China, like rhetorically, like very much kind of like Trump, ended up not being so anti-China policy-wise, because it's like, which illustrates the fact that Bolsonaro and Lula are not all that different in those aspects. It's quite illustrative, I think, of the fact that there are some economic underpinnings to that that kind of constrain what you can do, like on the ideological front. So I'll just put that note out there because it struck me, and when Alessandro was talking about that as well. But I'll let you guys take it from here.
I'll just make a very quick observation on Lava Jatos. I did some work for the IMF some time ago. And one of my conclusions there, as Lava Jato took its model from the Italian Clean Hands investigation of the early 90s, right? From the very beginning, the magistrates in Brazil said that their model was the Clean Hands investigation or Mani Pulite in Italy in the early 90s, which also fizzled out to a great extent and helped against corruption, but not so much. And maybe we're back in the previous situation. And one of my conclusions there was, in this paper that I wrote, was that the more politicized the magistrates are or are perceived to be, and the less effective they will be, because they will lose the support of public opinion, which is exactly what happened in Italy once magistrates started becoming, some of the inquiry magistrates started becoming ministers in this or that government, or being elected to parliament with this or that party. And, you know, it kind of exploded in Brazil because actually the main figure of the investigation was Sergio Moro, actually became justice minister in the Bolsonaro administration. So that kind of reinforced the idea in public opinion, certainly in the opposition public opinion, was that the whole inquiry had been politically motivated. And, you know, that kind of disqualified the whole inquiry. The problem is that, as Filipe has already said, that left the question of corruption, the anti-corruption fight, at basically back at square one, or even square zero, or even below zero, because then, you know, you cannot talk about the fight against corruption anymore, because every time someone will try, people will say, hey, this is politically motivated, all that. So I mean, the more politicized are the magistrates, or the more politicized they will be shown to be, and the less the anti-corruption fight will be effective and successful. On some of the other things, I just concur with what Filipe said. U.S.-China, I mean, Brazil-China is kind of inevitability to that, and I think to think that that's why I was saying the world has changed, right? Because maybe 10 or 15 years ago, it was okay to try and pretend that you're kind of equidistant between the US and China. Now it's become a lot more difficult. There's an open confrontation, and the dependence on China has not decreased. So that's very important. And in terms of Latin America, I don't know. I don't think that's, the role that Brazil tries to play is not as much of an irritant to the US or the West, but Jackie may know better than I do, as other questions like the Ukraine non-neutrality and all that. Obviously, the US likes better to deal with Latin American country one-on-one rather than dealing with them as a bloc. And also, Lula has the tendency of, give support to some pretty unsavory characters like, Maduro or Ortega or these sort of people. So that, but I don't think we're in the kind of axis of evil situation that was portrayed sometimes.
Yeah, I particularly wanted to pick up on the question about LAC neighbors and US versus the LAC neighbors. My own view is that Lula made a remarkably bad decision by his stand with Maduro on Venezuela. It is not the kind of leftist world that he remembers. And particularly now with Maduro saber rattling on the Guyanese border areas, the criminal state that is now Venezuela, even though we're up to 9 million Venezuelan refugees, 80% in South America. Brazil's sort of number 4 or 5, but it receives the migrants that are the poorest from the east part of Venezuela. So they are on the later waves of migration. And I think Lula can't deny what it is changing in the north part of Brazil, where he least can afford to have that high migrant population. So I think on the US side, I wouldn't say for Alessandro that the US prefers the one-on-one. The US has defaulted to the one-on-one situation because Latin America has generally not acted very well as a region, even if we think of the way the OES operates and others. And that is to Latin America's weakness. They all have a different thing they want from the US, or they want the US. So the US has, even if we look at Venezuela, so the Biden administration's recent initiative on Venezuela was the United States and Venezuela. One would have thought it should have been more of a regional negotiation, but those particular negotiations hadn't worked out well. So I think the United States sees itself going along with a lot of regional issues right now. So whether Brazil is with them or not is sort of not as much part of the strategy as Brazil would have thought. But I think that Lula is really missing this disconnect that the rest of the region sees by his positions with Russia and with Venezuela, at the same time that the region is going in a different direction. How can he exert global South leadership when he asserts positions that most of Latin America is not on the same page with him? So I think he's setting himself up for a foreign policy dilemma. Do we have any final questions before we break for Prosecco? I realize when I say it that way.
No.
That's a big dampener on.
So we are breaking for Prosecco. Thank you all.
One where the ideology makes a little bit because
Yeah, there are-
It's not that migrant problem, but it's like.
It's not Chile's
They're
problem, it's not
exactly
Chile's problem.
right.
And
It's not a
okay, we don't
domestic
even see
problem.
them.
It's like, it's like, what am I?
It's somehow.
Thing down to the ideological, it's like, then they can